I'd like to welcome all attendees to this first webinar in a series of 3 webinars hosted by the Future Climate for Africa program. My name is Karen Morris. I'm a communications officer at South North in Cape Town, South Africa, and I will be the moderator for this webinar. Our presenters today is Dr. Leo Meyer and Professor Jean-Pascal van Ypersele. If you have an interest in the work of Future Climate for Africa program, you're welcome to visit our website and the Twitter account to get in touch with us. I'm just giving the option. Okay, so I just want to explain how the program will work for this webinar. So our panel, as I explained a while ago, our panelists today will be presenting reviewing of draft IPCC assessment reports. In this webinar, we cover an introduction to the course, how the IPCC works, its functions, governance, and achievements, an introduction to an IPCC-style scientific assessment in relation to policy and upcoming events. We will only be exchanging questions once both presenters have finalized their presentations. Attendees are welcome to please forward your questions via the Q&A button or Q&A box, which you will find in your menu at the bottom or on the top of your screen. Please note that if you do raise a question, name which presenter the question is directed to. And as a facilitator, I will screen all the questions and relay them verbally to the panelists. We will aim to answer as many questions as you can in the allotted time period. But any questions that we aren't able to answer will be shared after the webinars on the FCFA website. The webinar is being recorded and will be shared on the Future Climate for Africa website and YouTube channel. So please consider sharing it with anyone within your networks or anyone you think who would like to view it but couldn't attend today. So with that said, I will now give over to Dr. Leo Meyer, who will do the first part of the presentation. And I'll switch my video off for the remainder of the webinar.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen, for that introduction, and welcome to all of you in probably very different time zones. I hope that the sound and visuals are okay and that all connections are working. It's the first time for Jean-Pascal and me to do this electronically. We're used to address audiences in a room, so you have eye contact, and now we have to sort of imagine all of you over the world. Hope it will work out well. By the way, the PowerPoints that we present will be made available as well at the website of FCFA, so don't worry about taking too many notes. And it will be recorded as well, as Karen already said. Now, the first, let me explain with the help of this graph why we are actually doing this. This graph is an analysis of the review comments that were produced on the first order draft of the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees last year. And as you can see, half of the review comments from expert reviewers came from Europe, a big chunk from North America, and then Africa had only 5%. Actually, this is already an increase compared to previous reports. During the 5th assessment reports, which ended in 2014, it was in most cases below 1%. And I felt, and many others felt, that it was important to increase the influence of reviewers from the African continent and also developing countries in general to the IPCC to come up with more balanced reports. So you have registered, and actually let me show the geographical distribution of registrations from Africa for this course. You can see Africa, most countries actually have submitted, some people from most countries have registered. It's based on the citizenship, and of course there are also people with African citizenship working elsewhere. And you may see that Nigeria is the champion with 57 people who registered. So it shows that there is indeed a lot of interest. And this also holds for other continents as well, as you can see in the next slide. From North and South America, a few, from European countries, some from India, and even someone from Fiji in quite a different time zone. Just a question to Karen, is everything still good, well visible, and can I continue this way? Hello, Karen? You're muted, could you?
Sorry, yes, everything is all good on my end.
Okay, then I'll continue. Let me introduce you to the courses as we have. Today is about IPCC in general, how it works for people who are new to this. The day after tomorrow, on the 7th, it will be actually zooming in on how to do an IPCC review in much more detail and with some guidance how to do it. Since you may have questions that cannot be answered during the Q&A session or may pop up later, you have the possibility to email questions on the webinar of today and that of Thursday to info@southsouthnorth.org, and we will try to answer them. The 19th of June, we will have the third webinar. First part we want to reserve for answering outstanding questions and answers from you, that we can deal with them. And then Professor Arthur Peterson and Professor Jacob Mulugeta from UCL London will go more in depth on the specific aspects of reviewing, and that is dealing with uncertainties and robustness of IPCC statements, and also some specific issues for Africa. More about this later. Then there is one specific thing I would like to mention. Currently, there are several reviews already going on. There's one on oceans that will end this month. The 1.5 degrees final draft, which is for governments only. And next week, a review will start on climate change and land. By the 19th of June, after our third webinar, we will open the possibility for a limited number of participants who are actually preparing review comments on these reports to send their drafts comments to us, the presenters, if they want, and then we can give them some feedback and help them in a one-to-one email exchange. More information about this and registration for that will be provided to you later at the third webinar. Now going to the IPCC itself, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and mind the word intergovernmental, not international. Only governments or nations can be a member of the IPCC, which was installed in the late 80s when climate change became visible as a problem and needed to be addressed on UN level by World Meteorological Organization. And UNEP, actually United Nations Environmental Program, is now called UN Environment. And they started to organize every 5 to 7 years scientific assessments of what we know about climate change, the impacts and its response options. And since the 90s, this has been done by large teams of scientists from all continents, primarily to inform the policymakers of the UN member states. Currently, the 6th assessment is going on. The mandate of the IPCC, it's what it is supposed to do is, and this is taken from the IPCC itself, a lengthy sentence, to assess on a comprehensive, objective, open and transparent basis scientific, technical and socio-economic information relevant to the understanding of scientific basis of risk of human-induced climate change, its potential impacts and options for adaptation mitigation. A long sentence, but what is crucial here, the risk of human-induced climate change, it means it focuses on that, but it also addresses, of course, natural climate change, otherwise you cannot see the human-induced signal. IPCC should be neutral with respect to policy and then it has to deal objectively with technical and socioeconomic factors. It means that IPCC also analyzes literature on policies, and of course that can be politically sensitive. Therefore, it's important that IPCC keeps its neutral position. You could say that IPCC presents a menu in a restaurant, but it is up to the visitors if they want to order something and what they want to order. That is not to IPCC, so it cannot prescribe any policy. Important also to know what is IPCC, what IPCC is not. There are some common misunderstandings. The IPCC doesn't do any research itself. It only evaluates what is already published in scientific literature and tries to withdraw the key messages from that. It does not recommend what policymakers or civil society or private sector should do. Jean-Pascal will come back to that. It doesn't pay its authors. All authors actually are volunteers. They're doing this in their own time, and sometimes with the permission of their bosses. And IPCC has a huge structure with a chair and co-chairs, etc. But they don't tell the authors what to write. They are really independent in that. And please note that individuals, persons that are not members of the IPCC, only the governments can be members, and they govern the IPCC. And let me show that in the next slide, what the key things is that the governments decide. And there are 159 UN member states, so it's almost all countries in the world. They elect all the dignitaries, the chairs, the vice chairs, and the other members of the bureau. The bureau is sort of the whole, takes care of the governance of the IPCC. They determine which reports should be made. They decide also about the scope and the outline, table of contents of these reports. And at the end, they adopt or approve it. It's a special process. And they also sort of has established the whole rule book for the IPCC, how these reports have to be produced, and lots of other things. Now, this whole work is managed by 3 different working groups and a task force, and each have their own co-chairs and secretariats. These secretariats are called technical support units, TSUs. And here you see an overview graph. At the top, the parents, WMO and UNEP, the plenary, the governments, the bureau, all the bosses, and the executive committee, which consists of the chair and the co-chairs and the vice chairs. They have a secretariat. And then we have the 3 working groups, each with their own co-chairs. Working group 1 is about the physical science basis. So it's that is the closest to natural sciences. Working group 2 is on impacts, adaptation, vulnerability. So there a lot of human science comes in, and biology and ecology. Working group 3 is on mitigation of climate change, which basically means reducing of greenhouse gases or preventing the Earth to warm due to human influences. And that is about policies and measures, costs and scenarios, etc. Then this 4th group is the Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories. They are responsible for the science, how to actually report on greenhouse gas emissions for each country, heavily used by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is about international climate policy. Won't go further into that. And they are also, of course, the work, the groundwork is all done by authors, contributors, and of course, the reviewers. And that is where you come in. Main products that IPCC has produced over the years are many, many, many. First of all, the huge periodic assessments reports are full assessments for working group 1, 2, and 3. And there are also what we call special reports. They are on a very specific theme asked by the plenary, and a couple of them are under review currently. There are also some other IPCC activities. The Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories produces good practice guidelines, methodology reports, which shows actually how you could, for different methods, establish greenhouse gases from different sectors in the country. Then there is another group, the Task Group on Data Support for Climate Change Assessment, and they facilitate the distribution of data and scenarios. They have huge databases of coming out of all climate models and assessment models. And on top of that, there are many, many expert meetings and workshops to facilitate discussions on specific topics during an assessment process where authors can discuss recent literature and actually what they should write in their report. This is my part. Now I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Karen to announce the second part done by Jean-Pascal. Thank you very much so far. Karen, up to you.
Thank you very much, Leo, for that presentation. I'll now hand over to Professor Jean-Pascal from Ypersele, who will now deal with the next few slides of the webinar.
Yes, and we can see your slide, Jean-Pascal, so it looks good. Jean-Pascal, I can't hear you. You're muted, Jean-Pascal. Hello, you're muted.
Yeah.
Karen, could you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah. Sorry about
okay.
that. I was trying not to disturb you if I was making any noise when you.
No. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So it's a pleasure to be able to join all of you in Africa and everywhere else in the world for this webinar. So continuing what Leo was explaining, we'll talk a little more about what are the scientific assessments that the expert reviewers are reviewing. And for that, we have to understand fully what is a scientific assessment from an IPCC perspective. First of all, it addresses a number of subjects and topics which have been identified through a scoping process that is preliminary to the report writing. The table of contents or the outline has to be approved by the plenary, which is the meeting of all representatives of all IPCC members. And then this assessment needs to contain the key conclusions that are useful for policymakers and all readers coming from the full span of available literature, available scientific literature, mostly the peer-reviewed literature, but there are some possibilities to use in case peer-reviewed literature is not available. And for subjects which are only covered in gray literature, there are some possibilities to use gray literature that is non-peer-reviewed literature as well, with conditions. Each chapter of an assessment report by the IPCC is written by a group of qualified authors from all regions of the world. It's important to realize that it's typically 10, 12 authors per chapter. So by definition, different views, different disciplines, different specialties are taken on board and taken into account when a chapter is written. You know that not everything is agreed 100%, to say the least. Therefore, when appropriate, the findings that the authors of the IPCC chapters are writing about are labeled with uncertainty qualifiers, like it is likely that, it's very likely that, it's extremely likely that, etc. And we will actually cover the details of this nomenclature and vocabulary in the third webinar later in this cycle. Yeah, I was struggling to go to the next slide. That's the next slide. A very key point that covers the whole writing and preparation process of IPCC report is that, as Leo said, the report have to be policy neutral, but to express things in another way, one can say they have to be policy relevant, so that is useful for the policy making process, but without being policy prescriptive. And there's a difference between being relevant and being prescriptive. You can be relevant by, for example, highlighting a number of adaptation or mitigation options and listing all the advantages and disadvantages of each of those options, but without prescribing one particular option, because that would take the job of policymakers who have, on the basis of value judgment that scientists do not have to do, policymakers have to make the political choices between those different options. In general, it's very clear that the IPCC report have to deal as objectively, as rigorously as possible with scientific information. So let's look at the IPCC report production cycle. It starts, as I mentioned earlier, with a scoping process where the topics to handle in the next report are identified and set up in a coherent outline. This outline has to be discussed, and sometimes it's amended and finally approved by the IPCC plenary. As soon as that is done, after that is done, there's a call for nominations among governments, organizations, through the IPCC website, through the IPCC focal point in each country. We'll talk more about them later. And that call is meant to assemble as many CVs of experts willing to participate as authors as possible. And then the IPCC working group bureaus, the relevant bureau, that is the group of people managing each working group, select the authors, and they can start to write and prepare a first order draft, as it's called. And that first order draft is subjected to a first type of review, which is called the expert review, where you can participate if you are a qualified expert. We'll talk a little later about how to become an expert reviewer. And on the basis of those expert review comments, the authors then prepare a second order draft. And that second order draft, which is prepared and published for the purpose of the review, at least a few months after the first one, is then subjected to a second review. And in this case, it's a combined review by governments and experts. Again, on the basis of those comments, and it's usually thousands of comments for each volume that are assembled that way, the authors then prepare a final draft of the report, and that final draft must be reflected in the best way by the so-called summary for policymakers, which also, it's not on this slide because it would be too complex, it's also subjected to 2 cycles of review. And in the end phase, the final draft of the report is not reviewed in detail anymore. It's not possible because it's usually more than 1,000 pages, and it has been subject of 2 full review cycles already. What's reviewed in the last phase, and the last phase is only open for governments, is the review of the summary for policymakers. Then, on the basis of the last version of the SPM, SPM in our jargon is the summary for policymakers, the IPCC plenary, again, or the working group plenary, if it's a working group preparing part of a report, discusses line by line and approves the text of the summary for policymakers and accepts its different verb. It's approved for the summary for policymakers, which is approved line by line. It's accepted for the full report, and then that full report is published. So that's the whole cycle that's used in the IPCC production cycle. And you can intervene in the review cycle number 1, the expert review, and also in the combined government and expert review. A few more words about the summary for policymakers, because as I mentioned, the report itself is accepted by the panel as a whole after it has approved its summary for policymakers, and approving the summary for policymakers, which is really a summary for policymakers and not a summary by policymakers. It's a very important distinction. This approval is really done line by line. For some sentences, it's even words by words, comma by comma, in a dialogue which is very fruitful between the main authors of the report and the government representatives, knowing that no proposal for change coming from governments will be made if it's not endorsed by the authors. So full consensus in the room among government representatives and the main authors has to be reached on each and every detail in the SPM, because there is no vote. So we have to work until everybody is equally satisfied. Of course, in case a country is really unhappy about a particular sentence or subject, it can have a footnote if it disagrees with the consensus, so that the process can continue to move forward, but it happens very rarely. Most of the work is done by consensus. So a report, a full assessment report, like the 5th assessment report, the last report that's available, knowing that a 6th assessment report is now being prepared, was made of 4 different parts. One contribution from each working group, as Leo explained, the first working group dealing with the climate science aspects, the second with impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and the third one with mitigation. And then there's a 4th version, a 4th document, which is shorter than the first 3 documents, which is called the synthesis report, and which, as its name implies, is a synthesis that is transversal and cross-disciplinary and based on the 3 contributions to provide in one document, which again has its own summary for policymakers, the synthesis information that's most useful for policymakers. All those reports in the past, of course, are available on the IPCC website, and I hope you have consulted them and used them. So a few words on how the IPCC interacts with society. I mean, these are a few of the remarks that could be made. There are many others, of course. The main client, if I can use that word, for the IPCC product are the members of UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and its process, which manages the convention, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and that's where the coordination of national strategies and policies and companies and civil societies are discussed every year during the COP in particular. The UNFCCC also decides how a different product that the IPCC is preparing as well, and that Leo mentioned them, it's those IPCC guidelines about inventories. And the UNFCCC decides how these guidelines have to be used for national greenhouse inventories. The work of the IPCC has been recognized when the IPCC was almost 20-year-old by the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, Nobel Peace Prize shared with Al Gore. But there have also been some turbulent times in the IPCC history. The IPCC was, for example, attacked in a totally unjustified way because some of its authors in 2009, which was the time of the Copenhagen summit, were wrongly accused of manipulating temperature data in order to demonstrate a particular viewpoint. But there have been inquiries about those accusations, and they were baseless. The IPCC was then heavily criticized, and there the reason for criticism was much better in a sense, even if it's a pity that it took place. In 2010, due mostly to one key error in one of its reports. It was about on page 500 in the middle of the second volume of the 4th assessment report, and it was about the speed of melting of the Himalaya glaciers, and it produced a lot of noise and a lot of criticism on the quality of the IPCC products. And actually it illustrates, in a sense, the importance of the review process, because to a large extent, this error could have been avoided if the review process had been even more thorough than what it usually is. But this crisis in 2010 led to the improvement of several IPCC processes and procedures, including more precise rules on how to use scientific literature, an enhanced role for people accompanying the author teams, and I will explain more what they do. And those people are called the review editors, and they help the authors to manage the review process. A better communication strategy between the IPCC and the outside world, a protocol also for to deal adequately with alleged errors and to correct them if needed. So this crisis, in a sense, led to useful improvement. The IPCC provided many times a very strong scientific basis for global climate policy. For example, the first assessment in 1990, published just 2 years after the IPCC was started, inspired to a large extent the text itself of the Rio Framework Convention, which was adopted in '92. So the convention is actually younger than IPCC. The second assessment report was very important to inspire the work and to provide a good basis for the Kyoto Protocol. The third assessment in 2001 helped the ratification process for the Kyoto Protocol and the design of all the detailed rules to implement the Kyoto Protocol, but it also led to the creation of well-defined adaptation and mitigation work streams under the UNFCCC process. The fourth assessment report provided the basis for the Copenhagen Accord and the decision which was then confirmed in Cancun in 2010 to do everything possible to maintain the warming below 2 degrees above the pre-industrial. That was using the fourth assessment of a report of the IPCC as a basis. The fifth assessment provided a strong basis, as you know, for the Paris Agreement, which reinforced the targets provisionally decided in Copenhagen, and the well below 2 degrees, working to stay below 1.5 and pursuing efforts to stay below 1.5 degree warming, funding with $100 billion and more after 2020, etc., etc. And then the sixth assessment report, which will be published for the synthesis report at least in 2022, will be a key scientific document on the table when the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement is taking place in 2023. So the Paris Agreement really was built, at least in part, as far as the scientific basis on the entire IPCC work. The timeline for this next IPCC report is the following. There was in March this year a conference of cities on cities, because cities and climate change will be one aspect particularly well covered in the mitigation volume for the next report, but it will also be the subject after 2023 of a special report on cities and climate change, but that's much later. Next year we will have a new report, a refinement of the guidelines for the inventories. But next October this year already, we will have the special report on the global warming on the 1.5 degrees C, both the impacts avoided if we succeed limiting the warming to 1.5 compared to 2 degrees or other values, but also what it implies in terms of additional mitigation efforts. Then the next special report a year later will be the special report on oceans and cryosphere, which is being reviewed right now, open for expert review right now. There'll be a report that will be opened for expert review as well on land use, desertification, and everything related to soils and what happens on continents. That will be for the summer of 2019. And then in April 2021, the first volume of the sixth assessment report, the second volume a little later, the third volume a little later, and the second volume on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability will be the last in the series, and together they will provide the basis to assemble the synthesis report in 2022. So this is the whole process, which is already informing today the Talanoa dialogue under the UNFCCC, which was previously called the facilitative dialogue, and it will inspire, as I said, in the future, the global stocktake in 2023. The review process, which is, as I said, really key to the quality and relevance of an IPCC report. Let's start at the expert review stage. I mean, there's an internal review process, which is totally internal and for authors only before. But the first review stage, which is open, is the review of the first order draft. It's open for 2 months. Then later, the second order draft, but also the first draft of the summary for policymakers is open for simultaneous government and expert review, again for 2 months. And then the final draft, it's only the SPM, which is reviewed and only by governments. A general principle is that each review comment must be considered objectively, seriously, by the authors, and the authors must respond to each comment. And both the review comment itself, the author of the review comment, exactly the sentence or the part of the document it relates to, and the response by the authors are published afterwards, after the report are completed. So the process is totally transparent. You can see later how the authors have taken on board or why they have rejected possibly some of the comments you might have made. The review editors are those senior scientists who are helping the authors to process all those review comments and make sure that the procedures are respected. And they have to sign off the comment and response files at the end and produce a report on how the author teams for each chapter considered objectively all the review comments. And this needs to be done before the report is finalized. These are the timelines for the expert review and the review periods that are open now or that will be open very soon. The ocean report, the expert review for the first order draft of the ocean and cryosphere report, and both oceans and cryosphere are together because the melting of the cryosphere has an influence on ocean sea level, for example, and that period ends at the end of this month on June 29. So you still have the possibility, if you have an expertise either related to oceans or the cryosphere, to contribute to the review of that report. Then since yesterday, actually, the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees C was open for governments only in this case, for the summary for policymakers, and this is until the end of July. Now, if you work with your government in your country, you may be able to contribute comments to the focal point in your country, but the focal point has to present those review comments as government comments. And then the last special report, which is now on the table, or will be on the table in a few days from now, June 11, from June 11, is the special report on climate change and land. And this is again the first order draft, which is subjected to the expert review. I would like to conclude very soon this explanation. Of course, there'll be 2 other webinars. Just a small remark in passing. Leo and I and Karen are responsible for what we said, and we are responsible for what we have shown in terms of slides here. We are, of course, responsible for the answers we will give, but we are not responsible for what the IPCC will do on its side. And you cannot assume that because you have followed this webinar, that your review comments will automatically be handled in a different way by the authors. Now, we are hoping that because we have explained in the best manner, we hope, how this review process works, that you will be able to contribute better to this review process and increase the probability of having an impact through your review comments. But the IPCC cannot be held liable for the content of this course, and vice versa. Future Climate for Africa cannot be liable for any decision taken by the IPCC. So now, as Karen explained at the beginning, we will have a 15 minutes Q&A session, and Karen will manage that, and I will let her explain the details, and you can read in writing. You can read here what's written about the next steps. You can send other questions before June 15 to that specific email address. The next webinar is this Thursday. It's about the details on how to conduct an IPCC review with examples of past reviews, etc. And then the third webinar will be about the details on how the IPCC treats uncertainties, which is a subject requiring review as well. How the IPCC assesses robustness of statements, specific issues for Africa as well, and this will take place on June 19th. So I believe this is my last slides, and I will hand over to Karen now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jean-Pascal, for your presentation. I will now verbally feed the questions that were raised during the webinar to both yourself and Leo. So the first question that came, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So the first
do we need to open the chat box or the Q&A box?
I will, there are two questions in the Q&A box, but I will read them out to you.
Okay.
The first question was for Leo. How were reviewers identified and or selected for the 2017 reports?
Okay. Well, there are several roads. What normally happens is, first of all, that governments and organizations can nominate expert reviewers, and they get an email with the link that they can register. Also, all those people that were nominated as an author to the IPCC but were not selected because they had to, there were many more nominations than were needed. They are automatically, they also get an email with the text, well, sorry, we can't have you as an author, but you're most welcome to be a reviewer. Thirdly, everybody who goes to the website of the IPCC can see an announcement of a current review and click on registration, and that is actually quite simple. In the next presentation on Thursday, I will show in more detail how that works, and I have prepared a supporting document with a step-by-step instruction how to enlist as an expert reviewer for the special report on land, which will start next week. So that takes care of that question.
May I add something, Leo?
Please.
Waiting for the next question. There is also a fourth way expert reviewers are associated, possibly, and that's through the focal points in each country. In many countries, the focal points have their network of scientists with whom they are in contact, and they spread the information about the review registration process so that it is known among universities, civil society organizations, where there are also some experts, etc. So that's a fourth way expert reviews can be found.
Okay, thanks for that. Next question.
Okay, next question. And this came through via the chat group. How can a country become a member of IPCC?
Shall I take that?
Sure.
As far as I know, well, there are 195 countries already a member of the IPCC, so only very few countries are not. If they wish to join, then I assume that their Ministry of Foreign Affairs needs to write a letter to the Secretariat of the IPCC, and then they can enlist. Jean-Pascal, would you know anything more about this?
Yes, that's basically what happens. But most countries are ready,
yeah.
because a requirement is to be a member of the UN or a member of WMO or UNEP, which means most countries in the world. Now, still, they have to ask to be a member. So to give you an example, Monaco was not a member until a few years back. And to become a member, I know that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there sent a letter to the Secretariat, and at the next plenary, they were accepted as a new member, and it was done.
Okay. Next question.
Okay. The next question is, how can IPCC address issues related to climate change?
Well,
can I answer that now? Yeah. Well, the issue addresses the scientific basis of the issues, but it doesn't address the it doesn't operate the action that relates to climate change. The IPCC is a scientific advisor. It is not the decision maker. So there's a very important distinction between the UNFCCC process, the process which manages the climate convention, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and the IPCC. Some people believe it's the IPCC who organizes those big climate conferences known as COP, but that's wrong. The IPCC is present to inform, that is correct, but they are not in the driving seat during those conferences. They are there to provide scientific information. That's exactly what we mean by being policy relevant without being policy prescriptive. I hope that clarifies the issue.
Thank you, Jean-Pascal. I think the next question was intended for you. It says, how often is the report produced?
Well, there's unwritten rule which says that a new assessment report is written every 5 to 7 years. Sometimes it's a little shorter, sometimes it's a little longer. But each time it's a plenary decision. I mean, it's not automatic that an assessment report is written every 5 or 6 or 7 years. And then as far as special report is concerned, it comes from proposals. You know, for example, the special report on lands and desertification and everything related to soils, etc., came from the combination of a proposal originating from FAO, among others, the Food Agriculture Organization, countries from North Africa in particular, insisting that there was a need for a special report on desertification, and the debate in plenary led to merge these proposals, and instead of producing one special report on agriculture and climate change, another one on desertification and climate change, another one, etc., which would have been very hard to manage, the plenary decided to merge the different subjects related to land on one side, merge the different subjects related to the ocean and the cryosphere on the other hand, and to prepare those two special reports for this particular cycle. For the special report on 1.5 degrees C, it is a special request made in Paris during the COP21, and it's written in the decision accompanying the Paris Agreement, and it's an invitation to IPCC to produce a special report on 1.5 warming, the differential impacts for 1.5 compared to other warming, and the additional mitigation efforts that would be required. So each special report is a different case, and each time at the end, it's a plenary, an IPCC plenary decision to have a special report or an assessment report at a particular time.
Thank you so much for that. The next question is also for Jean-Pascal, and it says, could you please elucidate more on UNFCCC and how it relates to IPCC? Because at times in literature, you find the two bodies used interchangeably.
Yes. Yes, I believe maybe this question was written before I answered the previous question, because it's very similar to the previous question where I explained that the IPCC is an advisory scientific body which has to be policy relevant, but cannot prescribe or even less decide any policies. That's really not its mandate. And on the other hand, the UNFCCC, the Conference of the Parties, which meet annually to implement the Framework Climate Convention, is a decision body which at the international scale decides what can be decided at the international scale in terms of climate policies. So the UNFCCC uses the IPCC reports and scientific information, but there are two distinct organizations, very distinct organizations, even if they talk to each other frequently.
Okay, thank you. Then there's a few questions that came through via email from one participant. It says, I'm keen to know more about how the government team per country are selected to become qualified authors of IPCC works, as they have to be ensured representatives of their government.
Leo, do you want to answer that, or should I?
I'm not. Could you please repeat the question once more, Karen?
It's essentially how are the authors selected, and
okay, I can explain that. There's a process for that. First of all, a call goes out to governments and international organizations to nominate authors for a certain report once the outline is approved. And then there's asked for specific expertise on the areas needed to be covered in that report. All these nominations are collected and from all continents. And then the managers of a working group that have to produce the report, they analyze the CVs of the applicants, basically like applying for a job. And then selections are made on several criteria. First of all, of course, a balance in expertise that is needed for a report on this different types of science, but also the background, people from academia, but also from environmental NGOs and from industry. And also very important, of course, regional distribution, not only scientific people from universities in Europe, but from all over the world. And then there is, of course, a need for a gender balance, which actually was quite bad in IPCC, but it has been improved, luckily, to have more women. And also, of course, you need some sort of balance between, say, old hands who know already everything and new people who may not know everything, but could give a new light on several issues. So all these balances are taken into account, and then the bureau of this working group and the co-chairs, they take a decision and that is then published. So for the 6 assessment reports, the 3 of them, I think there are over 700 authors have been selected from a couple of thousand nominations.
No, Leo, sorry, it's much more than a couple of thousand. I think in this case, it was six of the order of 6,000. So,
okay,
so
thanks.
It means it's also only one author selected for almost 10 nominations. So it's very hard these days to be selected.
Yeah, but it's good to know that there's so much interest. And still, I think that the balance between developing countries and developed countries still would need some improvement with having more people from developing countries. Okay, next question.
Okay, I'm going to read one from the Q&A. It says, who has the mandate to address issues related to climate and migration again amongst the UN agencies, UNFCCC or UNHCR?
Shall I take that one? I think all have a mandate to raise climate change issues, but climate change policy internationally, that is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, who make the overall climate policy directions for all countries that are parties to this convention. But of course, climate change is on the agenda of many, many other UN organizations and national organizations and companies as well.
Can I complement this, Leo?
Please.
Of course, the scientific aspects related to climate and migration, which was part of the question, are handled in the IPCC report, particularly the assessment report and particularly volume 2 on impact, vulnerability and adaptation. So the scientific aspects, the factual and the analysis of that issue are analyzed by the IPCC based on the scientific literature. But absolutely, as you said, any decision related to those areas is not for IPCC to take, but for those other UN agencies.
Okay.
Okay, and then I think we have time for one more question.
Sure.
And it's also via the Q&A box. It says, does the IPCC have a way of verifying data from countries on emission inventories?
Good question.
Could you repeat the beginning? Does it have a way to what?
Of verifying data from countries.
Data.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, again, it's not its mandate. You know, the IPCC has a task force on methodologies to prepare the inventories. But as I explained, the manner by which these methodological documents have to be used by countries, by companies, etc., is decided again by UNFCCC. So the IPCC suggests a number of methods to be used, says, for example, based on the scientific literature, the best way to assess methane emissions from this type of livestock activity is this and this. But then it's UNFCCC which decides how those recommended guidelines are used. And it's for UNFCCC to decide possibly on how to verify those inventories. So that's not managed by the IPCC either.
May I add to that? Within UNFCCC, there is a mechanism for verifying the data, and this is done by teams of specialists who visit a certain country, and they go to all their inventories and review them critically, and this is done mutually to make sure that there are no bloopers or big mistakes in those inventories. So the quality assurance and quality control is in the hands of UNFCCC itself. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much to both Leo and Jean-Pascal again. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have now for the questions. The rest of the questions will be addressed after the webinar and will be available with the recording and presentations via the FCFA website and YouTube channel. Participants who have joined today will receive a notification once all these are published online. We'd just like to thank you for joining us, but before you go, you could take a few minutes to answer some questions in a poll. I'll I'll launch the poll now. That one has just popped up on the screen. So if everyone can please take a few minutes to complete the poll.